The evening settles slowly over Rome, and as the sun disappears behind the distant hills, the city begins transforming into something different. During daylight, Rome feels loud and almost organized in its own chaotic way. But night changes everything. Torches flicker along narrow streets, shadows stretch across old stone walls, and every sound suddenly feels more important than it should. Footsteps echo longer than expected, conversations grow softer, and people glance over their shoulders a little more often. You start realizing something strange and slightly uncomfortable. Rome never truly sleeps. It simply changes personalities. Merchants close their stalls while gathering the last pieces of unsold goods. The smell of smoke rises from cooking fires and mixes with warm bread from bakeries, sweat from crowds, and the ancient scent of a city that has existed for generations. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs loudly, while somewhere else, a voice shouts in anger. A dog begins barking for reasons only it understands, and immediately several more decide to join in like they had been waiting for permission. The streets remain crowded despite the growing darkness. Workers return home, soldiers continue their duties, and wealthy citizens move with servants carrying lanterns ahead of them, while poorer Romans shift aside to make room. Everyone moves with purpose because standing still for too long in Rome often means becoming part of someone else's problem. As you continue walking, something catches your attention ahead. A group of men stands outside a building near a corner where torchlight barely reaches. At first, it appears ordinary. Men gather outside buildings all the time in Rome. But something feels slightly wrong. Their voices are too quiet, their movements too careful. One of them glances toward the street before quickly looking away. Another folds his arms and subtly changes position, almost creating a barrier without making it obvious. You slow your pace slightly, not enough to attract attention, just enough to observe. Rome teaches people an important lesson very quickly. If something feels strange, pay attention, not because curiosity is safe, but because ignorance can become expensive. One of the men leans closer to the others, and their conversation drops even lower. You cannot hear full words, only fragments carried by the night air. Names, places, maybe dates. Short sentences spoken quickly before disappearing. And immediately your imagination starts doing what human imagination always does whenever information is incomplete. It begins filling the empty spaces. Maybe they are discussing business. Maybe arranging a marriage agreement. Maybe planning political alliances. Or maybe, because this is Rome, they are planning something much more dangerous. Because conspiracies in Rome never begin with dramatic speeches beneath thunder and lightning. They begin like this: small groups standing quietly while everybody else passes by pretending not to notice. That is what makes them dangerous, not secrecy, normality. The most dangerous moments in history rarely announce themselves. Nobody enters a public square and shouts, "Attention, everyone, we are beginning a conspiracy now." Instead, they happen in quiet corners, at dinner tables, inside private homes, during ordinary conversations that appear completely harmless. And that is the unsettling truth about Rome. Power rarely moves loudly. It moves quietly until suddenly everyone realizes something important has already changed. You continue walking because stopping now would make you look suspicious. And suspicious people attract attention in places like this. Ahead of you, the city continues breathing around you. Carts roll across stone roads. Music drifts from distant houses. and conversations float through open windows before disappearing into darkness. Everything begins feeling normal again, but now you know better. Because once you notice Rome's hidden side, you cannot stop seeing it. Every conversation starts feeling important. Every glance begins carrying meaning. Every quiet gathering suddenly feels larger than itself. Somewhere behind you, the voices outside that building continue speaking beneath flickering torchlight, while Rome moves forward around them completely unaware. Or perhaps not completely unaware, because people in Rome often sensed that something was happening. They simply discovered what it was after it had already happened. You keep moving through the streets because in Rome, standing still for too long creates questions. And questions have a strange habit of leading to other questions that nobody wants to answer. The city around you feels alive in a way that is difficult to explain. During the day, Rome overwhelms you with movement, but at night, it watches you. That is the uncomfortable feeling slowly settling into your mind now. Somewhere above, light spills from open windows and dances across stone walls, while voices drift down from upper floors where families are finishing meals and discussing things that will matter tomorrow. Below that, down here on the streets where you are walking, another world exists entirely. You pass men carrying crates, servants hurrying between houses, soldiers walking in pairs, and citizens making their way through torchlight while shadows move beside them like silent companions. Nobody seems afraid, but nobody seems fully relaxed either. It is a city existing in permanent awareness. You begin noticing how often people look over their shoulders. Not dramatically, not suspiciously, just casually enough that it feels normal, which somehow makes it more unsettling. Because people do not develop habits like that without reason. Somewhere ahead, you hear laughter spilling from a tavern, and for a moment, the sound feels comforting. Loud voices, music, cups hitting tables, ordinary life continuing exactly as it should. But as you pass the entrance, you notice something unusual. Near the side of the building, away from the noise and torchlight, two men stand facing each other. Neither is drinking. Neither appears interested in joining the crowd inside. One speaks, while the other listens carefully without interruption. Then the second man reaches beneath his cloak and hands over something small. A folded piece of parchment, perhaps, or maybe coins. It happens quickly and naturally. The sort of movement designed specifically not to attract attention. Then they separate immediately and walk away in opposite directions as if they had never met at all. You keep walking because your instincts are becoming smarter now. Rome teaches quickly. Curiosity may satisfy your mind, but it can also create problems your mind cannot solve. Still, your thoughts remain behind with those two men. You tell yourself perhaps it was business. Maybe debts, maybe family matters, maybe nothing important at all. Yet your imagination disagrees, because imagination becomes dangerous when surrounded by incomplete information. It begins building stories where facts should exist. Every quiet conversation becomes secret planning. Every folded letter becomes hidden knowledge. Every stranger becomes someone more important than they appear. And the strange thing is, Rome encourages this kind of thinking, because Rome itself feels like a city built on invisible structures. You see buildings and roads and statues, but underneath all of it are relationships and promises and favors and fears connecting people together in ways outsiders never fully understand. A senator smiles at another senator during daylight and insults him politely in public speeches. then meets him privately at night to discuss agreements neither would ever admit to making. Friends compete with each other. Rivals support each other when useful. Allies become enemies, and enemies become allies depending on circumstances that change faster than weather. The city moves constantly, not only physically but politically, socially, personally. Everyone is adjusting positions all the time. And suddenly you realize something uncomfortable. Perhaps Rome itself is one enormous conspiracy. Not a conspiracy in the simple sense where a few men gather around tables making plans. Something larger than that. A city where every person is trying to gain something while preventing someone else from taking it away. Power, wealth, influence, security, survival. Different goals perhaps, but the same game. You turn down a narrower street now, where the crowds thin slightly and the noise from the city softens into distant echoes. Your footsteps sound louder here. Too loud. Buildings rise beside you with dark windows staring down like empty eyes. A cat darts across the road suddenly and disappears into shadows, causing your heart to react with embarrassing enthusiasm before your mind catches up. You glance around instinctively, suddenly aware that you are relatively alone. Funny how quickly confidence changes when streets become quiet. A moment ago, surrounded by crowds, you felt overwhelmed. Now surrounded by silence, you miss them immediately. Then you hear footsteps behind you. Not close, just close enough. You continue walking naturally because turning around immediately would make you look nervous. And looking nervous encourages exactly the sort of attention you do not want. The footsteps continue. Slow, steady, matching your pace almost perfectly. Perhaps coincidence. Probably coincidence. But probability feels less convincing at night. You turn a corner and finally glance behind casually. A man walks there carrying a small lantern. Ordinary clothing, ordinary expression, ordinary pace. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual. Yet something inside you remains unsettled. Maybe because Rome has changed the way your mind works already. A few hours ago, you would have seen an ordinary man walking home. Now you wonder who he is, where he has been, why he is here, whether he noticed you noticing him, whether he is simply walking or following. Your thoughts continue creating possibilities while reality stays frustratingly silent. Eventually, the man turns down another street without looking towards you once, and instantly, you feel ridiculous. Of course he was simply walking home. Of course nothing strange was happening. Of course your imagination has started drifting too far. Yet despite telling yourself this, despite logic returning slowly and carefully, another thought quietly enters your mind. You were relieved when he left, truly relieved, which means part of you believed the possibility. And once a possibility enters your mind in Rome, removing it becomes surprisingly difficult. You slow your pace slightly now, not because you're tired, but because Rome itself feels different after that moment. The city hasn't changed. The same streets stretch ahead of you. The same distant voices drift through the night air, and the same warm torchlight flickers against old stone walls. Yet something inside your mind has shifted. Earlier, Rome felt crowded and overwhelming. Now it feels observant, like the city itself has quietly turned its attention toward you. You continue walking past narrow buildings, leaning over the street as if they were trying to listen to conversations below. Somewhere nearby, footsteps echo briefly before disappearing again. A dog barks in the distance, someone laughs from an upper window, and then silence returns almost immediately, swallowing the sound like it was never there. The strange thing about silence in a city is that it never feels completely empty. There are always small noises hidden underneath it, movements too distant to identify, doors opening and closing, fabric brushing against walls, quiet voices speaking somewhere out of sight. Rome at night feels less like a place sleeping and more like a place lowering its voice. You pass a public fountain and notice several men standing nearby. They aren't talking loudly. They aren't drinking or laughing like the people in taverns earlier. They're simply standing together, waiting. One of them notices you approaching and briefly looks in your direction. Not long enough to seem threatening, not short enough to feel accidental, just enough to acknowledge your existence. You look away naturally and continue moving because you've learned something tonight. Not every question needs an answer. Behind you, low voices begin again almost immediately. You tell yourself they probably paused because a stranger walked past. That is normal, sensible even. But another part of your mind begins building possibilities once more. Perhaps they were discussing politics, perhaps debts, perhaps business, or perhaps something else entirely. Rome gives you very little information, and somehow your imagination always fills the empty spaces with things far worse than reality. The farther you walk, the more you understand something unsettling. People here do not survive by knowing everything. They survive by knowing what to ignore. There are conversations you pretend not to hear, faces you pretend not to recognize, situations you pretend not to notice. Curiosity sounds admirable in stories, but in Rome, curiosity occasionally creates funerals. Suddenly, you remember something said earlier in the day by an old man standing outside a marketplace. At the time, it seemed like meaningless advice spoken by someone enjoying the sound of his own voice. He had looked toward the Senate buildings and quietly said, "The safest Romans are the ones who mind their own business." You didn't think much of it then. Now those words return with uncomfortable clarity, because tonight you are beginning to understand what he meant. Rome is a city of enormous buildings and powerful men and public speeches. But beneath all of that, there are currents moving invisibly between people, pulling events in directions nobody fully understands. You realize that somewhere tonight, senators are making promises they won't keep. Somewhere generals are discussing loyalty while quietly measuring ambition. Somewhere wealthy citizens are arranging favors and debts that may change lives years from now. And somewhere ordinary people like you are walking through streets pretending not to notice any of it. The realization settles into your thoughts slowly as you stop beside another torch burning outside a stone wall. Maybe Rome's greatest skill isn't building roads or armies or empires. Maybe its greatest skill is making everyone believe they understand what's happening while the real story quietly unfolds somewhere else entirely. The night has grown quieter now. Though quiet in Rome is a very specific kind of quiet, it is not silence. Rome never truly becomes silent. Somewhere in the distance, wheels still scrape over stone streets. Someone somewhere is still arguing passionately about something that probably felt important 3 cups of wine ago. A door closes. Footsteps echo briefly and disappear again. The city breathes around you in slow, uneven rhythms. And as you continue walking beneath the dim glow of scattered torches, something feels different. Earlier tonight, you arrived with curiosity. Then curiosity slowly turned into caution, and caution gradually became understanding. Because Rome has a strange way of teaching people things without ever explaining them directly. No one sat you down and offered wisdom. No one handed you a guidebook titled How to Survive Ancient Rome Without Accidentally Becoming Part of a Political Situation. Instead, the city simply allowed you to observe, and little by little the lessons appeared on their You Think Back to Everything You Noticed Tonight. The crowded streets, the taverns full of noise and shifting moods, the conversations that seemed harmless until they suddenly weren't, the people gathering quietly in corners, the way certain names were spoken carefully and others weren't spoken at all. Earlier, these things felt disconnected, random details inside a massive city. But now they begin fitting together like pieces of a picture you didn't realize you were building. Rome runs on power, but not only the obvious kind. Not just armies and emperors and officials standing in marble buildings giving speeches. There is another kind moving underneath everything, quieter power. The power of information, the power of favors, the power of knowing who owes what to whom, the power of hearing one conversation and repeating only half of it to the right person. Suddenly, you understand why conspiracy stories spread so easily here. Because in Rome, they don't feel impossible. They feel logical. You stop walking for a moment and look upward toward the dark sky above the city. The stars remain visible between rooftops and columns, unchanged by everything happening below them. It's strange how calm they look compared to Rome itself. Underneath those stars, people are making promises they don't mean. Alliances are being formed. Rivalries are growing. Someone somewhere is gaining power while someone else is losing it without realizing it yet. And tomorrow morning, the city will wake up and continue as if none of it happened. Shops will open. Markets will fill. Citizens will walk through the streets discussing weather, business, family problems, and ordinary life while invisible forces continue moving around them quietly. That thought should probably make you uncomfortable. Strangely, it doesn't. Not anymore. Because something else has changed tonight. You finally understand that Rome was never pretending to be simple. You were simply expecting it to be. Earlier, you kept trying to understand everything clearly, trying to separate truth from rumor, reality from suspicion, important things from unimportant things. But Rome doesn't work like that. Rome exists in the space between certainty and uncertainty. Sometimes rumors become history. Sometimes truth sounds ridiculous. Sometimes the most unbelievable story in the city turns out to be completely real. And maybe that's why Rome fascinates people thousands of years later. Not because of its buildings or wars or emperors, though those matter too. It's because Rome feels familiar. Human beings haven't changed as much as we like to imagine. People still chase influence. They still protect power. They still trust the wrong people and suspect the right ones. They still whisper about things they don't fully understand. They still believe they can control events until events remind them otherwise. The streets around you are becoming emptier now. Torches burn lower. The air feels cooler against your face. Eventually you realize you've been walking without thinking about where you're going. And somehow you find yourself back near where tonight began. You stop again and glance back toward the city stretching behind you. Even now, it still feels alive, watching, moving, thinking. Rome does not feel like a collection of buildings. It feels like a living thing, a massive creature built from ambition and fear and pride and hope and chaos, endlessly consuming stories and creating new ones. And then a final thought quietly enters your mind before you leave. Maybe the real conspiracy in ancient Rome wasn't hidden meetings, or secret assassinations, or whispered plans in dark rooms. Maybe the real conspiracy was something much larger. Maybe it was the illusion that anyone was ever fully in control at all. Because emperors believed they controlled Rome. Senators believed they controlled Rome. Generals believed they controlled Rome. Yet one by one they disappeared while the city remained. Rome outlasted them all. And as you finally turn away and continue into the fading night, the sounds of the city growing softer behind you, you realize something almost comforting. Tonight, you didn't solve Rome. Nobody ever does. You simply experienced it for a little while. And perhaps that's the closest anyone ever gets. As the last torchlight fades behind you and the